As we saw in the first video, at the end of the 14th century, despite the Black Death and subsequent plagues, Sheffield was probably quite a well-known and prosperous industrial market town. In 1377, to fund the war his grandfather Edward III had started with France 40 years earlier, which we now call the 100 Years' War, Richard II set out to tax everyone in his kingdom, and to do that he needed to have everyone's details. These were kept on what are called poll tax or subsidy rolls. And at last we have a snapshot of life in medieval Sheffield. For instance, the subsidy rolls for 1378 show 749 people, including 34 servants, but excluding children under 15 living in Sheffield and neighbouring Handsworth at the time. How many people made themselves scarce when the taxman arrived, we don't know, however. As you can see, there was a full complement of trades concentrating on iron, cloth and leather working to satisfy the needs of a small town, and there were also weekly markets for other goods to be bought and sold. Most people also grew their own fresh food or hunted and fished where permitted. But what about Sheffield Castle? It would have had a large staff, but they don't seem to appear on the rolls. Maybe the town and castle lived separate lives. And another puzzle. Apart from Henry Schlatter the roofer, there are no construction workers mentioned. New roads and bridges were being built at this time, and houses, workshops, forges and watermills, as well as a stone castle, needed building and maintaining. Maybe the custom of builders avoiding the taxman is a lot older than we thought, and poor old Henry was just too slow. Or maybe such workers were actually part of the castle staff. Since leather was the period's all-purpose material, we find 3 cobblers, and 1 each of a cattle dealer, skinner, saddler and glover, but no tanners for preparing the leather. Maybe William Wood the Skinner did that. Sheffield was famous in later centuries for the stink caused by its tanneries, and if you don't know what caused that stink, you probably don't want to know. More significantly to the Sheffield story, there were also 1 locksmith, farrier and arrowsmith, as well as 2 wrights, 3 cutlers and 22 smiths. In fact, out of 64 tradesmen listed, nearly half were involved in some kind of ironworking. Add in others who weren't listed, such as other family members, apprentices and labourers, and you might have had more than 60 people involved in the trade. But only 1 merchant, John Chapman, is shown. So how did all those manufactured goods reach other parts of the country? Perhaps other merchants came to the Sheffield weekly markets, or maybe the ironworkers worked for the lords of the manor who handled the sales and booked the profits. This is not unreasonable, since the Lords Furnivall owned all the land and the means of production in Sheffield. The names of the townspeople are also interesting. After 300 years of Anglo-French rule, most of the family surnames are still based on Old English or Norse, whereas the first names are nearly all derived from French, many of them Christian saints' names. After another 600 years today, it's a bit strange to see how many of those names are still popular, although as you can see, some girls' names have dropped out of fashion. Some names look stranger than they really are. The Ot or Otter at the end creates a short version of a name, so Magotta is short for Margaret, like our Maggie, and Sissot is like our Sissy, which in turn is a pet name for Cecilia. One similar name ending today, of course, is Charlotte. And naming children after celebrities isn't a modern fad. The most popular names for girls in the town were the same as the ladies in the Furnivall families in the castle. The same applies to boys' names, except for John, which was easily the most popular boy's name in medieval England, but which doesn't figure in the names of Sheffield lords of the manor up to that time. From the Norman conquest in 1066, most ordinary people were legally tied to a manor and never left it, so surnames were generally unimportant. But with the growth of towns and the introduction of national poll taxes in 1275, it became more necessary to identify people individually. In the early days of small hamlets on manor lands, using the Saxon and Viking tradition of adding the word son after the father's name or nickname to identify a boy was usually enough. So in 1378 we see in Sheffield surnames which are still common today, such as Gibson, Hobson, Hanson, Rawson, Stevenson, Thompson and Wilson. As we saw earlier, despite the Saxon Viking ending, many of the fathers' first names are French in origin. Occasionally, where there was no father, a mother's name might be used, as in Empson, Emma's son, or even Wedderson, a widow's son. A more complicated construction is Matilda Digwayu Malkinson. Now, Malkin is a diminutive of Mary, so the name reads Matilda, the wife of Dick, who is the son of Mary. People also identified themselves after their topographical locations, such as cliff, dale, hill, marsh, milne, moor or wood. The word atta, meaning at the, gives that away. We know, for instance, there was a mill in Sheffield because Peter and Cecilia lived close by, and John lived at the cliff, or as we would say, at a cliff. But as the towns grew, so did the need for more specific names. Perhaps the most useful family names came from a person's occupation. Both the name and the occupation would probably be handed down through the generations. As we saw in the first video, the first recorded use of the trademark made in Sheffield in 1297 was by Robert the Cutler. Decades later, he would have been called simply Robert Cutler. In 1378, we can see at least 27 easily identifiable trades in Sheffield. Some names have the ending ER, which indicates a worker of some sort, such as Milner, a miller, Suter, a shoemaker or cobbler, Stringer, a rope maker, and Webster, a weaver. And these names are still common today. After the Black Death in 1348, many uprooted people came to Sheffield and identified themselves by their town or village of origin. And as you can see, some people seem to have travelled a long way. Another interesting thing for those who know their way around Sheffield are names such as Barker, Crooks, Darnell, Fulwood, Greystones, Porter, Machin, Trippett and Wadsley, all of which have left their mark on the city today. A few names in the Subsidy Rolls are a bit hard to fathom. Are names like these just mangled spellings of names spoken in a hard-to-understand dialect? Or are they real names simply lost in time? Finally, what about social rank? This generally comes in three forms: social status, authority, or wealth. John Maples would appear to have the highest status. An esquire was usually the son of a knight, and could even have his own coat of arms. Was John a military man or a local leader? And was he linked to the castle? We've no idea. But the steward of the manor, Thomas Shota, probably had the most authority. He looked after the manor for the lord and presided over the manor court, sorting out disputes and sales of land. He would also look after the manor rents, budgets and bookkeeping. The Lynott family were described as stewards of the Grange. The Grange is a separate farm within the manor. Maybe the Lynotts were in charge of the Lord Furnivall's Grange at Fulwood. In terms of wealth, we might look at how many servants people had. In all, 26 households could afford servants, with 5 households who could afford 2. But the overall winner in this competition was John Trippett with 4 servants. The rolls don't say who John was or what he did, but it must have been profitable, and he got a lane named after him near the town centre. At the other end of the social scale were the servants themselves. The rolls list 34, but many poorer children under the age of 15 were regularly employed to work as servants, as part of their education and to pay for their keep. Strangely, only 3 have been given surnames. Perhaps the others were considered part of the family, and actually, sometimes they were. Well, that's it. Studying tax records is a bit of an acquired taste, but hopefully some of that was interesting. The third video tells of the end of the castle and the beginning of Sheffield as a modern, independent industrial town. In the meantime, thanks for watching.